Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue with the wonderful book, The World's Greatest Ghost by Roger Bohr. This one is chapter 4, part 2, once again dealing with the theme associated with ghosts of the deep. These are the ghosts that are found in various bodies of water. We've already heard some pretty fanciful tales associated with these ghosts of the deep, and this part will continue that theme. So without further ado, let's start this part here. Then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it. I'd love to hear as well what your own opinions are, especially those of you that live on the local level of some of these entries. So the first one is called The Fisherman's Fear. And here's what it says. For hundreds of years, fishermen on the east and southeast coast of England have kept a watchful eye for a phantom schooner, the Lady Loverbound. They wonder how many sailors who met their deaths on the notorious Goodwin Sands had first spied the ghost of the three-master. The Lady Loverbound ran aground on the Goodwins and sank with all of her hands on February 13th, 1748. Captain Simon Peel, his bride, and some of their wedding guests were on board. Legend has it that the first mate, who was in love with the bride himself, killed Peel out of jealousy and then steered the ship to its doom on the Goodwins. 50 years later to the day, a three-masted schooner identical to the Lady Loverbound was seen heading for the Goodwins. The crew of a fishing boat followed her and heard the sounds of a celebration and women's voices. The schooner hit the sands, broke up, and vanished. The same apparition appeared to another ship's crew exactly 50 years later and was next seen by a group of watchers near Dell, Kent on February 13th, 1898. So does the phantom appear every 50 years? Watchers were on the lookout on February 13th, 1948, but visibility was poor and they saw nothing. North America also has a famous phantom ship lurking off Rhode Island. The Palatine left Holland in 1752, packed with colonists bound for Philadelphia. A fierce winter storm blew her off course, and when the captain was lost overboard, the panicking crew mutinied. The passengers spent Christmas Day in confusion and terror. 2 days later, the Palatine ran aground on the rocks of Block Island that began to break up. As the storm abated, the doomed ship began to slip back off to the rocks, drowned out to sea again by the tide. But before she could do so, dozens of local fishermen descended on the Palatine, took off the passengers, and then looted the ship. When their frenzied rampage had ended and they had stripped the Palatine of everything of value, the fishermen set it on fire and watched it adrift, ablaze from bow to stern out into the open sea. They watched in horror when they saw a woman appear from her hiding place on the Palatine and stand on the deck screaming for help until the flames swallowed her. There have been sightings of the ghostly vessel off the New England coast ever since, blood-red flames rising from a wrecked hulk. And then the next segment is called The Ghostly Swimmers. Seaman James Courtney and Michael Mission were buried at sea on the morning of December 2nd, 1929. They had died the previous day, asphyxiated by fumes while working below decks above the ordered tanker Waterton, owned by the City Service Corporation and bound from California to Panama. When the weighted bodies of the two sailors dropped into the Pacific, their fellow crewmen mourned deeply, for Courtney and Mason were two of the most popular men on the ship. One Fred said, somehow they made everyone feel good. But the crew of the Waterton were not without their dead colleagues for long. The day after their burial, the officers and crew saw two men swimming in the open sea. Captain Tracy put his binoculars on them and whispered, "Oh my God." But when the ship slowed to 10 knots and drew up alongside the swimmers, they faded like morning mist, only to reappear just 40 feet from the ship. At that distance, there were no longer any doubts. The men in the water were Courtney and Mason. For 3 days, the swimmers kept pace with the Waterton. Now there was no terror aboard the ship because everyone saw that the dead men intended no harm. At one point, they swam ahead of the vessel and seemed to be trying to divert her from the path of an approaching squall. Reporting later in the New Orleans office of the ship owners, Captain Tracy told his employers about the death and reappearance of Courtney and Mason. Tracy was provided with a camera and film and asked to substantiate his tale on the return voyage. It was a voyage without incident until they were in the Pacific again, and the deckhands saw two pale figures bobbing in the wake of the Waterton. By dawn, they were once more alongside the vessel, and with full light, the captain snapped 8 pictures at close range. Within a few hours, the swimmers had vanished. They were not seen again in the days that followed, and back in port, the captain took the film to company headquarters. Still wet from processing in a photographic laboratory, the roll of film was closely examined in company offices. One by one, the negatives were rejected. Then one of the executives lifted the A-frame to the light. "There they are," he said. When prints were made from the negative, the two pale faces emerging from the waves were positively identified by friends and relatives as those of James Courtney and Michael Machen. Next segment is called Terror Aboard UB-65, Doom Duty of a Dead Officer. Night was falling at the end of the bitterly cold day in January 1918 as the German submarine UB-65 slid into the English Channel looking for action. She was 15 miles off Portland Bill as the gray winter twilight deepened. The sea was rough, and then the sheets of spray drenched the conning tower. The U-boat's starboard lookout, screwing up his eyes as he peered over the bridge, was astonished to see an officer standing just below him on the heaving deck. What in God's name was he doing there? He must be mad. Come to that, how on earth did he get there anyway? All the hatches, save that on the conning tower, had been firmly battened down. He was about to hail the officer to warn him that he was in great danger when the figure on the deck turned and then gazed up from the bridge. Even in the twilight, the lookout recognized the face and his blood froze. It was the ship's former second officer killed in an explosion on the maiden voyage, his body buried in the military cemetery at Wilson's Haven. It seemed hours before he could move his lips. "It's a ghost," he yelled. The U-boat's captain rushed to his side, and he too saw the upturned face before the figure melted into the gathering darkness. This was not the first time that the phantom of UB-65 had appeared to strike terror into the hearts of the men who sailed in her. They had begun to dread the ghost as a harbinger of doom. Ever since her keel was laid, disaster had followed disaster until UB-65 became known as a jinxed ship. The submarine had been built in 1916, one of a fleet designed to operate off the coast of Flanders and create havoc in the Channel. Her crew was made up of 3 officers and 31 ratings. Only a week after work started on her, things began to go wrong. A girder swung into position from its chains and then crashed down, killing one workman outright and then pinning another to the ground. He could not be released for an hour and then died in agony. Before the submarine was finished, there was another incident, this time in the engine room. 3 men, overcome by fumes, died before they could be rescued. On her trial run, UB-65 ran into a fierce storm and a man was washed overboard. While she was on diving test, one of the tanks developed a leak, and it was 12 hours before she could be brought to the surface. The atmosphere was thick with poisonous fumes, and when the last of the hatches were opened, officers and men staggered out half dead with suffocation. But it was on her return from her maiden voyage that the UB-65 suffered her most violent shock. As she was taken in torpedoes, a warhead exploded, and in a terrible explosion that followed, the second officer was killed, and several men were badly injured. The officer was buried with full naval honors, and the submarine had to go into the dockyard for repairs. Some weeks later, just before the vessel was due to sail, a member of the crew crashed unceremoniously into the wardroom. Chalk white with shock, he gasped out, "Herr Oberlieutenant, the dead officer is on board." The captain accused him of being drunk, but he swore that not only he, but another rating had seen the dead officer walk up the gangplank. The captain and other officers ran to the deck where they found the second seaman crouching against the conning tower. He explained in a voice barely above a whisper that the dead officer had come on board, walked towards the bows, and stood there with folded arms. After a few seconds, he had vanished. The captain, fully aware of the impact such an incident would have on his superstitious crew, circulated the rumor that the whole thing had been a practical joke. Nobody believed them. Everyone knew that the ship was haunted. On each tour of duty, the U-boat carried its ghostly second officer. Men on watch jumped at every shadow. Word spread throughout the German Navy that the UB-65 was haunted and nobody was anxious to serve on her. Eventually, the authorities felt it was time such nonsense was stopped and sent a commodore to investigate. The high-ranking officer questioned the entire company. At first, he could hardly conceal his impatience with what he believed was superstitious fancy. After hearing all of the evidence, he was so impressed that he admitted he could understand the request by almost every member of the crew to transfer to another ship. Officially, the requests were never granted, but one by one, men were switched. The UB-65 was withdrawn from active service, and while in dock at the Belgian port of Bruges, a Lutheran pastor was quietly taken aboard to carry out the rite of exorcism. When she went to sea again, the U-boat had a new captain and crew. This captain refused to tolerate what he called damn nonsense and threatened any man who spoke of ghosts with severe penalties. Strangely enough, the ship carried out 2 tours of duty without trouble, but when the unbeliever was replaced, the spirit reappeared. The next trip was worst of all. During May of 1918, the UB-65 cruised in the Channel and later off the coast of Spain. The ghost was seen 3 times. A young petty officer swore he saw an unfamiliar officer walk into the torpedo room. He never came out again, and after 2 more sightings, the torpedo gunner went mad, screaming that the ghost would not leave him alone. He threw himself over the side, and his body was never recovered. In spite of her terrible history, the UB-65 managed to escape the massive onslaught on the U-boats, which came in the final months of war. On July 10th, an American submarine patrolling at periscope depth spotted her on the surface. The Americans prepared to attack and were in point of firing when the UB-65 blew up. The explosion was tremendous, almost unbelievable, said eyewitnesses. When the smoke cleared, all that was left was debris. Many rational theories were put forward to explain what had happened. It was suggested that the submarine had been rammed by another German sub, or perhaps the UB-65 herself had fired a torpedo that ran wild, but spectators admitted that none of them quite accounted for the force of the explosion. The nearest anyone could guess was that by some means the mouth of a torpedo tube had been so damaged so that when one was fired, it fouled and detonated the rest of the torpedoes in the craft. The company of 34 men went down with the UB-65, or maybe it was 35, for the ghost of the second officer was never seen again. Perhaps he had finished the terrible job he had stayed on Earth to do. And then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here. Once again, this was Chapter 4, Part 2. The theme involving Ghost of the Deep from the World's Greatest Ghost book by Roger Bohr. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. First segment was the one associated with the fisherman's fear. It's kind of like the telltale sign of a story where you're dealing with a lost ship. There was a tragedy on board. In this case, there was a lot of people that basically went down with a ship, and then that ship itself is the one that haunts that location. It was pretty sad, though, to hear that if it's true that the reason that the ship went down was because there was a lover's quarrel, I guess you could call it, or forbidden love. And then when that happened, that's when that guy essentially decided to take out everyone, take out the entire ship, and then steer it right into the rocks. And then that way nobody could have that love. It was that kind of bitter feeling that unfortunately caused everyone else to die there. Next segment was the ghostly swimmers. That was very unique. Honestly, that's the first time I've ever heard of something like that, where we've heard about ghosts appearing at locations, but as swimmers, and the fact that they're there around the ship for hours on end, it got me excited actually to hear that there was 8 pictures taken, and with one of them showcasing those 2 pale faces. If I ever do a video associated with this particular segment, then I'll try to see if I can find that picture, because that'll show 100% proof of actual ghosts captured right on film, in this case as they were swimming alongside that ship called the Waterton. And then finally, the last segment was the UB-65 Terror. Talk about a scary thing there. Here you have a situation where there's a ghost, apparently a deadly ghost too. A ghost that didn't seem to want to go away from that situation, from that submarine. and it was basically haunting it on multiple trips to the point where the entire fleet was thinking that it's haunted. Nobody wanted to serve there, and to the point that it even drove one of those guys mad. That's what apparently it was appearing to that guy, that poor guy, as many times as possible. Maybe people believed him, maybe they didn't, but some point he decided to just throw himself over, and when that happened, his body was never found. What a horrible way to go, especially considering, yeah, if nobody believed them, at least on that part. But then the fact that the UB-65 blew up makes you wonder if that was anything to do with this ghost as well. Maybe he drove someone else mad, and that person decided to take out the entire submarine or something along those lines. We'll never know, only because there's no evidence associated with what happened, since everything that was left was just debris, and then this thing just basically sank right towards the bottom, and it took all the stories with it, including apparently this vengeful ghost. But let me know what you guys think. Post those comments below about these particular segments. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.